My name is Teacher Seki Iligo. I am teaching history. Today's lesson is about nationalism and the decolonization of Africa. Let us have a grant on the definition of African nationalism. African nationalism, it was a desire of African people to rule themselves without being governed by the colonialists. It took place in the middle of the 19th century all over the African continent. Africans were struggling in order to gain their national independence so as to rule themselves without being governed by the colonialists. Thereafter, let us have a grant on the importances of African nationalism. Here are the importances of African nationalism, such that it brought unity. Among the African people who fought for the national independence in their respective territories, they united themselves so as to remove all the evils which were done by the colonialists in African states. So it brought about unity among those members of the Africans who united themselves so as to fight against the colonialists. Also, another importance of African nationalism is it brought political awareness among the African states, such that the Africans came to realize that they were able to rule themselves without being governed by the colonialists. Again, we had another importance of nationalism struggle in Africa, such that it rejected all the capitalist occupation over the African territories. The capitalists aimed at ruling all over the African continent. Hence, as a result, the Africans reacted so as to reject all the occupation which were brought by the colonialists in African states. Finally, also we had the self-reliant policy. It created the self-reliance policy among the African states such that they were capable of ruling themselves without being governed by the colonialists, and finally they attained their national independent African states. So those are the importances of African nationalism towards the colonialist invasion in African states. So let us have a grant on the internal factors which resulted in the rise of African nationalism. These factors were categorized into several categories, such that we had the economic factors. Here are the economic factors which resulted in the Africans to fight for their national independence, such that the colonialists invented exploitation as well as humiliation and a poor working condition among the Africans, such that the Africans were working for so many hours without being paid. If they were paid, they were given low wages. At the end of the day, this brought about the reaction of the Africans towards the colonial invasion in African states. Hence, they decided to terminate all the colonial rule in African territories. So those were the economic factors which resulted into the rise of African nationalism. Thereafter, we had the political factors which resulted into the rise of African nationalism. Africans' traditional practices were denied. For instance, the Africans were denied from being represented in the colonial legislative bodies. As the Africans decided to think about on how they can manage to be represented in the colonial legislative body, if not in the legislative body as well. So they decided to fight against the colonialists so as to get their own African representative in the legislative body. So those were the political factors which resulted to the rise of African nationalism. At the end of the day, they gained their national independence. So apart from the political factors, also we had the social factors. Africans' traditional practices were denied, such that they were denied to get education. Most of the Africans, they were despised from getting education, as well as social services such as water supply, they were inadequate among most of the African states. All these evils resulted in the rise of the struggle against the colonial rule in Africa. Again, apart from the social factor, we had the cultural factors. Here are the cultural factors which resulted in the rise of African nationalism, such that Africans' traditional practices were denied, such that polygamy is the act of having many wives. So these kind of practices were denied by the colonialists, as well as the way of dancing, music and religious aspects among the Africans were denied. All this brought about the reaction among themselves. At the end of the day, they decided to terminate all the rules of colonialism over the African continent. Also, the other internal factor which resulted into the rise of African nationalism, we had the Italo-Ethiopian conflict. The Italo-Ethiopian conflict also resulted into the rise of African nationalism. It was due to the fact that the conflict which arose among the Italians and the Ethiopians, they fought war. That war, finally, the Ethiopian emerged the victor after defeating the Italians. So other African states, they came to realize that even themselves, they were capable of fighting against the colonialists, such that the Ethiopians, they were capable of terminating those colonialists through that war and defeated them. So other African states copied that example. At the end of the day, they decided to unite themselves so as to fight for their own independent African states. So those were the factors which resulted to the rise of African nationalism. But we have another factor here, which is the role of colonial education. The role of colonial education played a great role towards the rise of African nationalism in African states, because the colonial education prepared the educated elites in Africa, such that Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, whom they helped their fellow Africans to fight for their national independence. This brought about the rise of the African nationalism in African continent. Finally, successfully, most of the African states gained their national independence through these internal factors. But apart from these internal factors which resulted into the rise of African nationalism, also we had the external factors for the rise of African nationalism, such that we had the role of the ex-soldiers. After the World War I and the World War II, those Africans who were recruited as soldiers to fight for their colonial master in Europe, they came back in Africa. As soon as they arrived in Africa, they decided to teach their fellow Africans about different war techniques. Because during the war, they learned several military techniques, and they learned on how to use different fire weapons such as guns. So all these knowledges were invented among the Africans, and they came to realize that they were capable of fighting against the colonialists and terminating all the colonial rule in African states. So that was the external factor which resulted into the rise of African nationalism. Apart from the role of ex-soldiers, also we had the rise of UNO. The rise of the United Nations Organization in 1945, immediately after the end of the Second World War, also resulted into the rise of African nationalism against the colonialists, such that this organ implemented the colonizing power to permit all the people whom were ruled in their respective territories to be granted their national independence. So this organ supported the colonialist struggles both materially as well as morally. So this facilitated most of the African elites and the rest to fight against the colonialists so as to get their national independence. Apart from the role of United Nations Organization, also we had the rise of USSR. USSR was the United Soviet Socialist of Russia. This USSR, it aimed at spreading socialism all over the world. So they wanted all the colonialists to grant freedom and independence in their respective territories, because socialism highlighted all the evils which were practiced by the colonialists in their respective territories. At the end of the day, they brought about problems among the African states, and finally the reaction was about to terminate all the colonial rules in Africa. So that brought about the rise of African nationalism against the colonialists. Apart from the rise of USSR, we had the independence of Ghana in 1957. The independence of Ghana in 1957, which were held by Kwame Nkrumah, taught a lesson in most of the African states that they were capable of fighting themselves and rule themselves without being governed again by the colonialists. Simply because Kwame Nkrumah managed to brought about independence in his country. So the rest of the African states decided also to fight for their own nation. Apart from that independence of Ghana in 1957, we had the rise of the United States of America. United States of America, it was a great nation during those days. So Americans persuaded all the European powers who were ruling the African territories to leave them free, to grant them independence through the open door policy which were arised in the United States of America. The open door policy required the freedom of all the states to rule themselves without being governed by the colonialists. All this brought about the rise of the African nationalism among the African states. Also, we had the independence of India of 1947. The independence of India, it was the important aspect to the rise of African nationalism in African states, simply because in India, they got independence peacefully without warfare. So also this taught a lesson in most of the African states that even themselves, they were capable of attaining independence through the war, through the peace and harmony method without having any war. So all these were the external factors which resulted to the rise of African nationalism. And here it is where we mark the end of our lesson today, which has shown us on how African nationalism resulted to the decolonization of the African states. At the end of the day, most of the African states got their national independence. Thank you.